Welcome to Mormon Springs, Mississippi. Come along with us. Let's go explore. My kids and I have been doing YouTube for about a year now, and we occasionally happen upon some really neat stories that make it fun for us. This is one of those times. I knew the Mormon Church had a presence in Mississippi, but I didn't realize it was so historically significant. And don't forget, if you like this kind of content, why don't you hit that like button, share it on your favorite form of social media, and maybe even subscribe. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was organized on April 6, 1830. Missionaries first arrived in northeastern Mississippi in 1839. And as the marker says, here at Mormon Springs, many converts to the church were baptized. Using stones to dam the stream, the Mormons made a baptismal font just east of the ford that then crossed the stream. The Buttahachie branch of the church was organized here in 1843. No one seems to know too much about these Mississippi Mormons, but like an assistant LDS church historian said, maybe that's because they only made up about 3% of the pioneers who went west. Like I said, the Mormons came here in 1839. The Southern Mission soon encountered shootings, tar and featherings, and even some beatings. But the church historian says that for the most part, Southern homes opened to the missionaries in friendship, but they also closed behind them without yielding many baptisms. As we walk around Mormon Springs, I'm going to tell you a little of the rest of the story. Monroe County was a little different for the Mormon Church, however. It was populated with people that had immigrated from cotton country of Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Alabama. Many immigrants coming in the 1830s. Most people in this part of the county were kin. When the Latter-day Saints arrived in 1843, the new converts spread the Mormon gospel among their families. And by 1844, a congregation of some 200 Latter-day Saints was thriving. This congregation included African Americans as well as whites. It was called the Tombigbee branch of the church after the river that is real close by to where most of them had made their homes. The congregation was thriving here in Monroe County, and on June 27, 1844, Joseph Smith was martyred in Carthage, Illinois. Joseph Smith was the founder of Mormonism and the Latter-day Saint movement. After Smith's death and persecution against Mormons began to be more frequent, Brigham Young began gathering the saints, but he sent a guy named John Brown back to Mississippi. John had actually opened the mission here in Monroe County. In 1843, he came back here, and while he was a charismatic leader of the local branch of the Mormon Church, he married one of his converts, a lady named Elizabeth Crosby, in May of 1844. After the martyrdom, he was recalled to Nauvoo. He returned to Mississippi for his wife, and they had just built a home in Nauvoo when, because of all the Illinois persecution and general persecution of Mormons all over, he was sent back to Mississippi to gather the local saints and join the main pioneer camp along the Platte River. On April the 8th, 1846, John Brown led 19 wagons and 43 people from Mormon Springs, Mississippi, toward the gathering place. He was going to come back in the fall of 46 for the rest. These 14 families chose William Crosby, who happened to be John Brown's father-in-law, as their leader. They drove their oxen some 640 miles to Independence, Missouri, in less than 2 months. When the Mississippians made it to the Platte River, they did not see Brigham Young or any of his followers. They all met together and decided that Brigham Young and his saints must be traveling up on the north side of the river, ahead of them along the Oregon Trail. They packed up their wagons, and during the next few weeks, they faced possible Indian raids, stampeding horses and cattle. They conducted their first buffalo hunt, and a nighttime windstorm that overturned wagons and jerked up their tents. They met up with travelers returning from California who told them that there were no Mormons ahead of them on the trail. They met up with a guy named John Reshaw, and he invited them to winter in Pueblo, Colorado with him. The Mississippians in their wagon train entered the fort at Pueblo on August the 7th. The fort was manned by 6 or 8 mountain men. They soon received word that the main body of saints were wintering along the Missouri River. John Brown reported that they were sorely disappointed they were not able to reunite with the main body of the church in the Rocky Mountains. The Mississippi Mormons spent nearly a year in Pueblo. They hunted for survival. They planted pumpkins, beans, melons, and even a turnip patch. They worked for trappers who paid them in corn. All the while, they earnestly worked to gain new converts. This year in Pueblo made the Mississippi Saints the first religious group to establish a colony in the West since the Catholic missions were established in 1769. The first white births in Colorado were these Mississippi women at Pueblo. The community at Pueblo was the first of more than 500 Latter-day Saint communities to be established in the far west over the years. One of the mountain men in Pueblo is noted as saying, "We arrived at the temple for a dance and were rather taken aback by finding ourselves in for a sermon," which of course they received before the dancing began. John Brown then returned to Mississippi for the rest of their families. He arrived here at Mormon Springs, Mississippi in January 1847. Brigham Young sent John Brown word to leave the Mississippians in place in Mormon Springs, Mississippi for another year. He was to pick a few good men to join the advanced company. John Brown returned to winter quarters with 4 white men and 2 African American servants. There were 3 African Americans with the advanced company that arrived in the Salt Lake Valley in July of 1847. At least 2 of these African Americans were Mississippians. The advance company had left winter quarters on April the 8th and reached Laramie on June the 3rd. There they were welcomed by 17 of the saints from Pueblo, many of whom were from Mormon Springs, Mississippi. There were several Mississippians in the advance party that arrived in Salt Lake Valley on July the 22nd. They planted potatoes, beans, and buckwheat by the time Brigham Young arrived in the valley on July the 24th. The Mississippians had also mowed the grass and planted a turnip patch. John Brown returned to Mississippi and crossed the plains for a 5th time, where he led 13 families, 56 white people, and 34 African Americans toward the Salt Lake Valley. They arrived there in October of 1848. There were now about 200 white Southerners and 37 African Americans, all from Mormon Springs, Mississippi. The majority of Mississippians then built a town 9 miles east of the original Salt Lake Fort. This was the first town in Utah outside of Salt Lake City. It is now called Holiday, after a Mississippian who was one of the early bishops of the war. In March of 1851, this community, or most of this community and its 75 or so families, migrated to Southern California. In Southern California, these Mississippians and a few others founded the community of San Bernardino. Many of these Mississippians returned to Utah during the Utah War and then packed up again to help colonize Arizona. Many of their families live in Arizona today. These Southerners performed miracles time and again when they established these communities and made their homes in them. There are many more stories that could be included here, but for those you'll just have to do a little research on your own. There is one story about Alice Rowan. She's an African-American daughter of two of the servants who came to California. Alice became a school teacher and taught at Riverside. She may very well have been the first African-American to teach at a white school in the United States. I'm standing in Mormon Springs, Mississippi when I took this picture. John Brown, who you see here, led so many Mississippians from their baptism in these very springs to achieve so many important firsts to the history of their church and to the history of our country. I hope you've enjoyed exploring Mormon Springs, Mississippi with me today and learning about some of the important stories its people have to tell. Thank you.